He is very well known in our community, and I'm not going to take time he could be using to enlighten us. So I will say that he is, we consider him a special friend of GMU. So with that said, please, General Hayden.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be back among friends. That's actually a very good and comforting thing, given everything that's going on today. So I'm going to refer back to the notes here occasionally, but for the most part, I'll just be stalking the stage, trying to relate some things. And I guess if I was going to kind of give a headline as to what this will be, it's and now for something completely different. And completely is too big a word. But I know the agenda, and you've been talking about cybersecurity and blockchain and so on. And I actually have a briefing back home that might actually add to that conversation about cyber sins and cyber sinners. But I was asked by Dr. Wells to kind of shift the weight of the conversation a little bit this morning, okay? And from the direction of cyber narrowly defined to information broadly defined. And the conflict, combat, competition in an information domain. So with that, let me begin. I'll try to be very efficient, leave a lot of time for questions and comments, because that's obviously where I actually pick stuff up, and that's why I'm here. So I usually begin the story by talking about my first encounter with the cyber thing. And that gets me assigned to San Antonio, Texas, in January of 1996. I am coming out of Europe, where I was the J2 for U.S. forces, and the war of the time period, if you recall, was in the Balkans. All right, so a lot of time spent in Croatia, Serbia, actually Bosnia Herzegovina, and so I was coming from a conflict that was kind of medieval in both its origins and its conduct, and I get reassigned like we do to San Antonio, to what was then called the Air Intelligence Agency, which was on the cutting edge of thinking about things cyber. And my new command was very kind, but I'm going to summarize for you now my first 4 or 5 day orientation. It was, they never said this, but if I boil it down, General, we're glad you're here. Now sit down, take out a clean sheet of paper, and write this down. Land, sea, air, space, cyber. It's a domain, it's a place, it's a location. We're going to go fight there. And that was my introduction. And usually when I use that to start my narrative, I start going to CNO, CNE, CND, CNA, and all the subsets of combat in the cyber domain. But what I've taken to explaining lately is when I was down there in Texas, we actually had a grand debate amongst ourselves. And those of you who know I don't say this to trade groups because it's really obscure stuff, but for this audience, you know there are two commands down on Security Hill. You've got Air Intelligence Agency, and you've got what was called then the Joint Command and Control Warfare Center. And I was in charge of both. In any event, we had this theological debate up on Security Hill as to whether or not we were in the cyber dominance business or the information dominance business. Right? And cyber kind of self-contained the way I described it for you already: computer network operations, exploitation, defense, attack. Information dominance, all those other things, which we have touched in the past, psychological operations or MISO, deception, public diplomacy, public affairs, you get the whole information bubble thing. This was a debate that made us feel like Jesuits at a medieval university debating matters of theology. And I mentioned the two commands. It kind of divided up amongst the AIA guys over here, go cyber, and my Joint Command and Control Warfare folks over here, go information. And so we had this debate, and although we didn't put a seal on anything and decide what we were going to do, you can probably tell, since we now have a cyber command and not an information dominance command, where our center of gravity finally landed. We are over here in cyber dominance. lots of reasons. Number one, that was hard enough. All right? I mean, it was just challenging to get our arms around everything that we ought to be doing there, and we're still trying to do that. So it was kind of degree of difficulty, hard enough. And by the way, you can't get over here into this bubble, the information bubble, the information dominance bubble. I mean, we didn't. Without 3 or 4 sentences into your conversation, start bumping into American law, First Amendment considerations, Fourth Amendment considerations, and so on. And so I think we as a nation have planted ourselves over here with the scope of our vision being loosely defined as cyber dominance. The Russians went to door number 2. And if you read Valery Gerasimov's article, 5 or 6 years ago now, in which he talks about contactless warfare, using informational means to affect the population of the target country, you will see that the Russians are over here, and I think doctrinally, Admiral Studeman and I were talking about this over breakfast, I think we are doctrinally over here, and it's hard for us to respond to this stuff because our vision of what it is we do is broadly limited, constrained, bookended by our cyber dominance point of view. Does that make sense? And so what I'm going to try to talk about now is over here in the second bubble, in the information dominance bubble. So I became more or less acquainted with this. I just had a book come out about 3 weeks ago, and it talks about many things like this. And in the research for the book, I tracked down a fellow named Clint Watts, who you've probably seen on network TV. But Clint has really studied what it is I'm going to tell you about now. All right? Clint is a West Point graduate, done a lot of contract work for the intelligence community and Special Operations Command. And Clint tells a story that, 2013, 2014, he was part of a broad project, right, which was the countering ISIS use of the internet, countering ISIS use of the World Wide Web. And we're talking about ISIS-controlled, ISIS-facing, ISIS-favoring botnets and how ISIS was doing that. And as Clint was doing that work, he noticed that there was another universe of botnets over here that seemed to be vibrating in sympathy with the clearly ISIS botnets. And he pursued it, and I'm probably oversimplifying it, and you need Clint here to kind of show you his charts and graphs and how he arrived at that. But in essence, you had this separate net over here that wasn't ISIS-facing, but was vibrating in sympathy with the themes of ISIS. And he looked at it further, and he, kind of the eureka moment was that, his summary, the Russians had taken their old active measures campaign and fast-forwarded it into virtual space, into social media. And what we had here was a Russian-facing, Russian-controlled network that, in its spare time, was stirring this pot. But the longer he looked at it, the more it was outward-facing towards the West and including inside the United States. And so the way Clint tells the story is the first population that the Russians bubbled, right, with this kind of informational control bubble, the first population they bubbled was their own. And they used that for reasons of autocracy and political control inside the Putin regime. Right? And then they slowly began to take their show on the road into what they call the near abroad. And so we have some really concrete examples of it. Y'all recall the invasion of Crimea, right? And remember the little green men and balaclavas and no patches, and I mean, like it's not hard to figure out what's happening here, right? And yet, the Russian information machine, the kind of son of Valery Gerasimov's seminal article, the Russian information machine puts an informational bubble over the seizure of the Crimea in such a way that it slows Western response, because it slows Western identification, because it slows Western consensus building as to exactly what's going on here. A little later, recall now the Russians, in addition to grabbing Crimea, have nibbled at the Donbass and have a presence in eastern Ukraine. And recall that horrific summer day when clearly Ukrainian separatists, assisted by Russian specialists, fire a Buk missile at a Malaysian airliner flying out of Schiphol in Amsterdam, heading towards Malaysia. Now, for people in this audience, I mean, this is like an IQ test, right? You know what happened. And I write in the book that we probably also know what happened because of imagery and communications intelligence and electronic intelligence and heat signatures. I mean, this is probably not elevated rocket science to build a case. But the Russian information machine, and this was actually quite remarkable, began to throw so much information into the mix as to what actually happened to the Malaysian airliner. I mean, there were a series of alternative theories, to your, I suspect, point of view, each more incoherent than the one in front of it, including that the Ukrainians thought that was Vladimir Putin's airplane, and they tried to shoot it down. There was a co-altitude Ukrainian fighter in the vicinity. Finally, the one they finally landed on was shot down by a Buk, but it wasn't ours, it was the Ukrainians. Okay? And they walked the narrative through this, throwing up so much dust, okay, that well over 90% of the Russian population believed the final Russian story. And most of the European population, man on the street kind of thing, most of the European population said, man, that is really a complicated issue. That is really a complicated incident. It's really hard to tell what happened. Okay? And again, we're back to Gerasimov and working over here in this bubble. Oh, by the way, and we're slow to recognize this. Clint Watts, the fellow who's, I sat up in a Manhattan office for half a day taking notes while he's showing me the slides. And Clint fundamentally points out that as he's discovering this in his ISIS hunt, right, he goes then to his government masters and says, I got this stuff going over here, and it's probably a little unfair of me, but probably not untrue either. His government master said, we paid you to look at ISIS. And he really was unable to get much traction within our broader community about, hey, I think these guys have stepped up their game, the Russians, in a way that's very different. Clint then tells the story in 2015 that the Russians really took their game on the road, and they brought it here to North America for a minor military exercise called Jade Helm 15. Jade Helm 15 was a special operations exercise, again, very modest in proportions, that was taking place in Texas and in several other southern states. Russian botnets, and here's an important aspect of this, Russian botnets echoed by, not control, I'm not suggesting operational relationships, but Russian botnets began to hit the theme that this was a secret Obama administration attempt to round up political opponents, a theme that gets echoed over here in American alt-right media, Alex Jones, InfoWars, Gateway Pundit, and a few others. Okay? That this is actually a roundup, up to and including stories that abandoned Walmarts were going to be used as concentration camps to pull in the political prisoners, and that there have been sightings of boxcars transiting Texas with leg irons attached to the floor of the boxcars. Now, Barack Obama said it was his most favorite conspiracy story while he was in office. Okay? But it got so much traction that the governor of Texas decided to call out the State Guard, which is part of the Texas Military Department, but is a group of volunteers, called out the State Guard to observe the feds, to be able to report to the Texas population, there's nothing to see here, folks, move along. That's remarkable in as sophisticated as a society as our own, that took place. And Clint's view then is that when that happened, the Russians decided, okay, we can go for the gold here. We can work and get inside these folks' heads. Let me pause just for a moment and just talk just for a moment about Russia. I do a fair amount of public speaking, and one of the favorite themes they asked me to come is what keeps you awake at night. And so I get to talk about geopolitics, and here are the North Korea and Iran and terrorism and so on. And obviously Russia's on the list. But what I say about Russia, in counterpoint perhaps to China, is that Russia is not a resurgent power. Russia is a revanchist power. And I actually, at that point, I generally show a slide with a little bar graph that compares the gross domestic product of the Russian Federation to that of the state of California. And the Russians are about 2/3 as a nation of what our state of California is in terms of GDP. I was on Morning Joe 3 years ago now, and Putin had done, maybe 4. Putin had done something uncomfortable, and we were complaining about it. And we were about ready to break the commercial. And I'm in D.C., they're up in New York. And I say, hey, Joe, can I say one more thing before we break? Yeah, General, what do you got? And I just blurted out, Joe, you realize he's doing all this, and he's got nothing more than a pair of 7s in his hand? All right? That he knows he is playing a weak hand. That because he has a weak hand, he's playing it very, very aggressively. Let me give you almost a Saturday morning cartoon version of what I think Russian strategy is, all right? Now, remember, it's a cartoon. So over here, you got all the adult nations eating a fine meal at a very big table. And the Russians, I get the nuclear power thing, I get the veto in New York thing, but fundamentally, they don't have the horses to compete with the very best over here. So they're kind of over here at the kiddie table. And Vladimir, his social contract with the Russian people is no longer, hey, I'm going to be autocratic, but don't worry, you're going to be rich. That was the deal when oil was 120. All right, at 62, he's got to have another theme. And now the theme is, I'm still going to be autocratic, but don't worry, you're going to be proud. And so he somehow has to restore Russian pride and address Russian grievances. And what he really wants to be able to do is to seat Russia at that table. But I already told you his chair's too small, and I've suggested to you he can't make his chair much bigger. So remember, I told you it's a cartoon. So every night, in my vision, Vladimir comes over here to this big table and slices off about 3/4 of an inch from each of the legs. Okay? So that someday that table is going to be short enough, he's going to slide that chair over, and it looks like it just fits perfectly. And again, I told you, it's kind of a Scooby-Doo approach to geopolitics, but I think it captures the Russian effort, which is not to try to match, but to try to pull down, to try to detract, to try to pull us down to their level. So that explains, for example, Russians pouring more fuel on the fire of Brexit. That explains Russians attacking NATO unity. It explains Russians attacking, in this social media space, Russians attacking the European Union. It explains Russians attacking democratic processes in Western Europe, and it really explains Russians attacking democratic processes inside the United States, which they did in the 2016 election. And again, back to where I began in Texas, cyber dominance, information dominance, they're over here in the Gerasimov-defined, doctrinally described, informational means to attack the population of the target company. So let me quickly run through the scenario for the election, and this is a well-informed audience, so I'm not going to belabor it, but I do want to mention it. So it all begins over here. It all begins over here in the cyber domain, narrowly defined, right? With a cyber theft. Remember, emails from the Democrat National Committee, emails from John Podesta. And I go out of my way, again, this is a knowledgeable audience, but when I say this to, as I said, trade associations and more public groups, I actually go out of my way to say that the theft of the emails was actually honorable international espionage. Okay? That is actually legitimate state-on-state activity. And I kind of imagine myself back at NSA, and some young operator and analyst come running into my room, my office up there on the 8th deck, and in essence saying, hey, General, you won't believe it. We have busted into United Russia, which is Putin's party. And let's just assume we care what Putin's party says, because it's a different kind of system. All right? We've busted into United Russia. We have access to the emails. What do you want us to do, boss? Well, I mean, the answer is obvious. Steal the emails. Right? And then I add to the general audience, and the punchline is, we do that without asking permission downtown. I mean, that's what nation states do to one another. Okay? And so the theft is, as bad as it is and as offensive as it is, and shame on us for allowing it to happen, right? The theft isn't the big news. And unfortunately, a lot of the public discourse is about the cyber attack and the theft of the emails. That's not the new news. The new news is then taking that data, bringing it back over here, weaponizing it, and then shoving it back into our informational space through WikiLeaks, DC Leaks, Sputnik, RT, and, based upon the Mueller indictments, like the cast of The Americans, right? Because they had a dozen or so operatives here in the United States trying to stir up American passions in response to what it was the Russians were doing. The ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment that was published, let me just very briefly mention the findings. The Russians did it. Right? It was very sophisticated. It was on a scale we have not seen before, although we've seen this kind of thing. It was personally approved by Putin, and it had as its objectives the messing with our heads, check. Punishing Hillary Clinton because he hates her, check. Undercutting and delegitimizing the inevitable Clinton administration, check. And then finally, midsummer, late summer, the realization that other guy could win, and according to our intelligence community, in a unanimous judgment, preferring Donald Trump and pushing votes in his direction prior to the election. All right? So that's what the Russians did. They still do this, okay? And I'm going to make a point later on that they're able to do this because of our own societal weaknesses. They're able to do this because of our own sociology, because of the depths to which our own political discourse has descended. I mean, this Russian story I just gave you, if we were doing it, we would call it a covert influence campaign. And I'd be the last one in the room to claim we've never tried a covert influence campaign. But there's kind of an iron law of physics within a covert influence campaign. And the iron law of physics is it doesn't create fractures in a society. Successful covert influence campaigns identify pre-existing fractures and then exploit those fractures to drive populations further apart. Let me reinforce that kind of plot line and also bring the story a bit more up to date to kind of emphasize that this is still going on. How many remember the president's speech in Huntsville, Alabama, the last Friday in September? That was a stem winder of a red meat speech in front of the president's base in which he trotted out much of the language of the campaign and then added for added emphasis, for God's sake, it's Alabama, all right, roll tide, so to speak. He adds for extra emphasis the whole take a knee controversy. Remember this? He goes out there and It says SOBs, except it doesn't use initials, and for good measure, he talks about the NFL changing the rules for player safety and how he's opposed to that. Not appealing to the best angels of our nature here, all right? And anyway, he puts this idea out there starkly about take a knee and gets energy from, feeds the base, a narrative that further divides us. Before the president gets back to the East Coast that night, the three leading hashtags in Russian-controlled botnets, the Internet Research Agency, St. Petersburg, right? The three leading hashtags are NFL, take a knee, and demonstrating that even people who have mastered two languages often have trouble with articles, indefinite articles. The third trending hashtag was take the knee, okay? Kind of suggesting maybe not a Native American doing that one, all right? NFL, take a knee, take the knee, and playing both ends. It's both tastes great and less filling. They are playing the patriotic end, and they are playing the core right of free speech end. They don't care. They don't have a dog in the fight in terms of how this ends up. They just want to multiply the division. Echoing again what the bots are doing, alt-right media goes crazy with take a knee. The same suspects, Alex Jones, InfoWars, Gateway Pundit, and so on. And unfortunately, the alt-right media takes this real racial real fast because of the demographics of the NFL, the demographics of the players who had taken a knee. Now, some of you know I'm from Pittsburgh. I follow the Steelers very, very closely. The Steelers actually enter into this plot line in a very big way. Remember what happened this Sunday? That's a late Friday night speech, right? The NFL is thrown totally off balance because half the league is getting on an airplane within 12 hours of the speech in Huntsville, right? And teams are trying to decide what it is they want to do, right? The Steelers decide they're not going to decide. The Steelers decide not to go out for the anthem because they can't get team unanimity. And then the blindside left tackle, Alejandro Villanueva, walks out to the top of the runway so he can see the flag and puts his hand over his heart. Now, Alejandro is a West Point graduate, Army veteran, multiple combat tours, and totally within team unity. The team knows Alejandro's got to do something a little different here, all right? But that picture of him there, by the way, his jersey became the best-selling jersey in NFL trademarks for several weeks after that. It was such an iconic picture. Grabbed by the alt-right media again, and the Russian bots. The Monday after the Steeler game, I think it was the second or third leading hashtag was Alejandro Villanueva in the Russian-controlled botnets. And the Steelers subplot feeds the racial dog whistles of the alt-right because the Steelers coach is Mike Tomlin. And I mean, I've done a lot of research. I've read this stuff. It really goes very, very ugly. So, president saying something here. Botnets pick it up. Alt-right media kind of get into this sympathetic vibration going back and forth between them and the botnets. And then it bleeds over into American network news. In this particular case, via Sean Hannity at Fox. It bleeds from Fox, from Hannity, to all the other non-news parts of Fox. All right? Shows up in Fox and Friends on the curvy couch. And guess who tweets his approval for the story? Now, that is not collusion. All right? That is what I call in the book convergence. Everybody there did what they did for their own purposes. The president for political needs with regard to the base, the Russians because they want to mess with our heads still, the alt-right because they're conspiratorial, Fox for ratings. But you get the impact of all of those doing what they did in terms of what it does to divide us as a society. And so back to my iron law of physics when it comes to covert influence. You can't do it unless there are already native divisions. And we have very, very strong native divisions. And it's just kind of like, here, hit us with this, please, in terms of Many of the Russians do not have to create themes. They grab themes from our own political discourse. And so it's already in the American vernacular. Right? So I mean, Putin's not a genius, and this isn't rocket science. But they are really taking advantage of it. By the way, I did the math. There are 1,750 American athletes who suit up for the NFL every Sunday and Monday. The Sunday before the president's speech in Huntsville, 6. Didn't do anything other than stand at attention for the anthem. This was not a national crisis, but you see the dynamic. I've got a few other things I want to talk about, and then give you all time for comments. So I'm when I go out, and I apologize again for mentioning the book, but these are the themes that I'm using here today. When I go out for the book, they want me to give them a really short summary as to what's going on. You know, what's the book about? And what I describe, and I realize I'm getting a little bit of feel from technical things, but I'm going to pull it back to our line of work here before I'm done. What I describe is kind of a three-tier cake, with the biggest tier of the cake, the base tier, being us, and I've already described some of the things happening with us. And I describe it as we as a society have moved into a post-truth culture. Post-truth was the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year in 2016. Post-truth described as decision-making based less on evidence and data and more on feeling, emotion, preference, loyalty, tribe, or grievance. And the second layer of my cake here is an administration that brilliantly identified that during the campaign, exploited it, and I think from time to time makes it worse. And then the third layer up top is the Russians coming in over the top and exploiting what's going on in the first two layers. And so I point out very carefully in the book, the long-term solution here is heal ourselves. I mean, the Russians tried this against Norway too, you know. Doesn't work because Norway's not going through the same internal dynamics that we are. So what are we to do about it? I mean, besides heal our political dialogue, I mean, what is it we should do now as professionals? What are some of the things that we can undertake? And again, probably beyond the narrowly defined intelligence lane, but something to which intelligence can contribute. So just a few ideas. Number one, political advertising in social media. There's no reason it should not be as controlled as political advertising in broadcast media. I mean, that's just kind of a given. Okay? Number two, I think, and here we are moving into technology. Number two, I think we have the technology that can determine to a sufficient degree of certainty when I'm being tickled by a human being or a server farm. In other words, when I can identify, again, to a degree of adequate certainty, that person I'm arguing with isn't a human being, that I am responding to a manipulation created by a server farm, a botnet, and so we might be able to suppress some of the artificial stimulation of our own dialogue just through the application of technology. And again, we'll probably filter out some real people who appear to be part of a botnet, but again, to a degree of certitude sufficient, we might be able to dampen the artificial stimulation. So you've got the advertisement, you've got trying to suppress the effects of botnets. Another reality is most people now get their news off of social media. Right? Most people actually get most of their news from Facebook. Right? And the problem with that is that it is by and large uncurated news. It comes at us. It's hard for the average user to discriminate between and among different sources of news. And so an idea that some folks have struck upon is kind of Rotten Tomatoes for news sites. You all familiar with Rotten Tomatoes for movies? Right. I mean, it gives you a rating. You don't always have to agree with it. And I've gone to some movies that had ratings in the 30s for Rotten Tomatoes. All right. But I knew what I was getting into. Okay. All right. And so So I said that on Bill Maher about 2 weeks ago. He actually brought it up. He said, you got an idea in your book here about Rotten Tomatoes. Explain that. So I did. Let me make sure I'm getting the sound out here for you guys. And I explained it. And before I got off the set, I got a text from a company called NewsGuard that actually is now getting that underway and expects to have it up and running before the midterm elections. So there are technical efforts out there that we can take advantage of to guard against us, to guard against this. There's another aspect to this, and still in the technical lane. As part of the research here, I got to listen to a lot of smart folks. One of the smart individuals I listened to was a woman named Zeynep Tufekci, who is Turkish by birth, North Carolinian now by choice. And she was giving a talk on social media, and she was talking about, again, going to enterprises like Facebook, and how the algorithm governs our transit through the universe of information. And she used, and I use it in the book, she uses the metaphor of Doritos. Okay, can't eat just one. And you can't eat just one because it gives you salt and fat, which automatically creates a craving for salt and fat. And so her description is, you go onto Facebook, you're searching for truth, for news. Okay? Facebook knows who you are, right? Perhaps better than you do. And Facebook's business model, engine to get return on investment, is to keep you on the site. It is number of clicks, right? That's how you generate profit. And so Facebook gives you something that is by and large pleasing to you, consistent with your previous work, consistent with what it has identified as your previous preferences. And Tufekci points out, the longer you stay, the more it bends you in the direction of information sources that agree, maybe even more strongly, with your going in position. In other words, the basic algorithm drives us this way rather than this way. And what happens is we get reinforced in our predetermined beliefs and perhaps become more radicalized just because of the nature of the algorithm and where it points you. There's a fellow named Roger McNamee who wrote an article in The Atlantic about 3 or 4 months ago now. McNamee is an early investor in Facebook and an early mentor of Mark Zuckerberg. McNamee, in a longer article, far more technologically elegant than what I just gave you, says what I just told you. He said, it's the algorithm. It is the basic functionality that allows us to go this way, and I'm not even going to get into the basic social divisions we have because of globalization and so on, but the algorithm then adds to that, moves us in the direction, remember, not of data and evidence, but in the direction of feelings, emotions, preferences, tribes, grievances, and loyalties. The technology has gotten ahead of our social norms. Okay, one or two political comments at the end, or policy comments actually, and then I'll stop and open this up to questions. So you saw Kirstjen Nielsen yesterday, Secretary of Homeland Security, testify before the Congress. It wasn't a committee, it was y'all come. Whoever wants to come on down, and we'll talk to you about how we're protecting the vote. And that's a good thing, all right? That's how you actually protect the actual vote, the count, all right? X, Y, Z, how many people pulled which lever. That's a good thing, all right? But that's not what the Russians did. So I understand we need to protect the actual mechanics of voting. But the Russians did not affect the actual mechanics of voting. Now, they touched some of those networks, and people who know this better than I, back to Gerasimov, messing with our heads, undercutting confidence in systems and in processes, people who know this better than I think the Russians touched the voting networks, simply to instill fear in us on our part that the vote itself may actually have been corrupted, not to actually corrupt the vote, but to create the effect in our minds. So good, DHS is going to go protect the vote count, super. But we have not yet developed a national plan to fight back this whole 35-minute story I just told you. All right, the messing with our heads via social media and other means. Until, when I get modestly critical here of the current administration, the president, because of the way God made him, cannot dissociate the Russian story from some people who are using it as an attack on his own legitimacy, from the Russian story as hey, this is a big deal. We got to make sure it doesn't happen again. And we're having trouble with the president going back and forth between those two realities. I know there are big differences, but I compare the Russian story I just told you a little bit to 9/11. I get big differences, but the rationale, the comparison with 9/11 is the Russian attack was from an unexpected source against a previously unknown weakness, very much like 9/11. And the way we respond to an attack from an unexpected source against a previously unknown weakness is to go extraordinary. All right, in post 9/11, you saw what President Bush did in terms of resources, people, structures, law, policy. We went extraordinary to plug the gap. Right? If we don't go extraordinary on this particular problem, NSA will do its job, CIA will do its job, FBI will do their job, but we will not go extraordinary. Everyone will play in their traditional lane, and we will be, by definition, insufficient to the needs in responding. And until we get this presidential level direction, we got to go fix this, I fear we're not going to go fix this in the way it needs to be fixed. It's fascinating. In the worldwide threat briefing, about 2 months ago now, D&I Coates was out there in front, and they had all the three letters behind him, NSA, NGA, CIA, and so on. And they were specifically asked by one senator, have you been told by the president to organize against what the Russians did? And Director Coates and all the other directors said, no. And so I think that's a failing, because I do think there are things as a government we can lead to better protect ourselves against what the Russians did. Remember, over here in the information dominance bubble, not just the cyber bubble. One more turn of the wheel and I'll stop and happily take all your questions. Mike Rogers was at that session for the worldwide threat briefing. He was one of the ones who said, no, I've not received special instructions. A week later, Mike was in front of a different committee, this time Armed Services, right? And this time as Cybercom Commander, not as Director of NSA. But politics being politics, he gets the same question. Well, I noticed you last weekend, so have you ever received any direct? No, I have not. He said, well, does that, and then he gets asked kind of the follow-on question. This is where it really gets interesting. He gets asked the follow-on question, so are the Russians going to continue to do this? Oh, yes, sir, they're going to continue to do this. Well, what can we do to stop them? And here's the pivot. It's a fascinating answer. Mike departed from, we need to defend our, he didn't do anything about defense. But what Admiral Rogers said was, we have not yet imposed sufficient costs on them for their behavior. You're seeing the pivot here, right? Not defense, this is offense. And Mike goes on to describe the kinds of things he might be able to do, not to defend against what the Russians are doing, but to dissuade the Russians from doing it in the first place by holding at risk things that they believe to be dear. It reminded me, now he didn't use these words, but you can see these words taking shape in his testimony. Remember in the nuclear era, we had this theory of deterrence, and we would use our weapons for two kinds of attacks, counterforce and countervalue. Counterforce was disarming the enemy. Countervalue was holding at risk things the enemy held dear. And so counterforce in this and Mike made this suggestion, was going after the server farm, disrupting, destroying, delaying the actual specific tools that were being used to do this behavior. But you all know that quickly becomes whack-a-mole, and it's not a permanent solution. And so what Mike was suggesting, what in the nuclear era, and I realize this is a little bit overly dramatic, but in the nuclear era would be called countervalue, right? Holding at risk, not the things threatening us, but things you really don't want to lose. A week later, Paul Nakasone, now the commander of Cyber Command, is in front of the same committee, Senate Armed Services, for confirmation. He gets asked the same question, and he gives the same answer. And so what you have are two commanders of Cybercom, one outgoing, one incoming, saying, you know what I lack and what might be a good idea is a political legal structure that allows me to operate above the threshold of routine espionage, but below the threshold of what anyone would consider an armed attack. The legal and policy structure to do that, now my words now, not theirs, as a matter somewhat of routine and how we operate in this domain. Now, that is not U.S. government policy. And I had private moments with Tom Bossert and Tom's deputy, Rob Joyce, all right? They started getting shaky and saying, we're not going there. But I just suggested to this audience that there are at least some folks out there thinking serious thoughts, really big thoughts, as to how it is we might respond to this in ways that are different than metering our own information flow or suppressing activity on our own social media. Okay, I'll stop. I hope that was useful. But Lynn's request was to move from narrowly defined cyber to this much broader question of information and how it is we as a society, as a military force, as security specialists, survive in an arena of conflict that perhaps is even much larger than the one we imagined over here, narrowly defined cyber. Okay, I'm done transmitting. I'll take any questions you might have.
Reminder again, we got mic runners on both sides of the room. Just raise your hand. We got one up here front. Let's wait for the mic, sir.
Right here.
Thank you, General Chan Swallow from the Joint Warfare Analysis Center. You talked a lot about Russia and how they would have a seat at the kiddie table. Can you talk a little bit about China, who has a seat at the big table with a large economy?
Yeah. So, very briefly, geopolitically, Russia's revanchist, not resurgent. You and I call China resurgent. The Chinese say it's restoration. It's not resurgence. It's a return to the natural order of things. I see China as a competitor, not necessarily an enemy. In fact, I make a point that they shouldn't be an enemy. And I see the issue with China as China is confident, and maybe the danger occasionally is they're overconfident, whereas the issue with Russia is they're not confident. And the real danger there is what might they do because of their own perceived failures, weaknesses, difficult future, that sort of thing. So I would handle them in different ways. I would kind of meet the Chinese at the merge because I do think we need them. And Sino-American relationship is the key issue of the 21st century. I think it'd be good to have better relations with Russia. It would be good if Russia was heading in a different direction. But here the problem is don't let Russia be the spoiler that Russia wants to be. The power of Russia right now is the power to disrupt, not to create.
Question in the back left.
Here we go.
You could stand up, please. Question.
Good morning, General. Greg Rowe. I work with Defense Intelligence and have worked in the Joint Staff and stuff before. At one point, years ago, we had a U.S. information agency, things like that was mostly a Cold War-focused type of agency that kind of speaks somewhat to the efforts you're talking about. What I think I hear you saying is there's not political/policy will to do those type of things. We can take technical measures through cybercom and other means, and that's just at the technical level, but not the informational level. Do you see Is that the solution you see we have to go towards? Is more
So-
of a, it has to be political will
Yeah,
to do this?
probably part of it, but I get the reality that, back in the day, you could run a mimeograph machine in the basement and really be conducting a covert influence campaign. And nowadays, it's much more complicated. But I do think that there are better things we could do in the information domain. So remember, we need to go extraordinary, right? And we need presidential direction to go do that. My usual follow-on is this has to be not just whole of government, but whole of society response. So that, for example, obviously about our own political dialogue, but young Mr. Zuckerberg might have more responsibilities about this than he previously foresaw in terms of the development of his technology. They're just a broader sort of things that make the problem more manageable. I don't know if it's just throwing the switch on USAF again, but it is a recognition that we operate in this domain. Look, I'm going to go way political on you real fast, all right? We are our own worst enemy in terms of our current political dialogue. When we have people coming at us with untruths, but they're using the untruths we have created on our own against ourselves, the solution kind of suggests itself.
Another question in the back left, if you would stand so the journal can see you.
Morning, sir. Have you heard about the attack of unknown vulnerability using clicks of interest within the algorithm of Facebook? In my opinion, the vulnerability is only possible to be used because we need to give people the capability to criticize the tons of suggestions they receive every day using technology. Isn't it the case that we need to reinforce education, reinvent education to prepare people to criticize the suggestion that we receive during the live? It's a matter of, nowadays we can see, it's a matter of national security. Because if we allow people to interfere in the people interest, they can interfere in the nation directions. Isn't it the case to be extraordinary by reinforcing education?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, again, I try in my writing, I try to step back from this a little bit, and I'm on the same point that you're suggesting. What's happened is, all right, we everybody in this room certainly, all right, we in our generation, our habits of discrimination with regard to data coming at us have been the habits that have been developed in a world in which most of our lives, our news has been curated for us by professionals. Now, for better or for worse, all right? CBS did that, NBC. I get all that, and there are some dangers there, too, with regard to the curation of the news. But it has largely been curated, checked, sourced. So we don't get outside certain boundaries. So that's our habit. That's our education, right? And now most of our news is coming at us uncurated from sources that we might have great difficulty identifying, and we have not. You're right. We have not educated ourselves. So one hopes my grandkids get this. We have not educated ourselves how to be more discerning in a world in which the information is really raw. I mean, just think of our own profession in intelligence. The difference between an analytic report and raw intelligence is night and day. And what you've got out there now for most of America is raw intelligence coming at them, not the benefit of analyzed information. There's another aspect to this too, all right? Philosophically, and I talk a lot about the Enlightenment, believe it or not, in the book. Philosophically, we want free speech, access to information, right? It's a good in its own right, I get it, it's a human value. But we really want it because access to information, free speech, data-based stuff, all right, is the best preparation for intelligent decisions, okay? So that data and decisions are connected. And therefore, we oppose suppression of speech, suppression of data, because we think it leads to bad decisions. What's happening now is speech is not being suppressed. Speech is being overwhelmed. There is so much data coming at us that we actually now have begun to break the link between data and decision making because we've become so confused at the data. Malaysian airliner, almost all of Russia and some fraction of Europe. That's just too hard to figure out. And so we've broken the link between data, speech, access, and deciding. Domestically, I think we're doing the same thing with regard to the Mueller investigation. Okay? We're just creating so much data that most people beyond Manassas just given up trying to follow it.
Question back right.
Ron McCready, longtime fan of your Dernzagrams.
That's a long time ago.
Just a few. Question, and especially speaking to our partners here, opportunities in the future, current and present, with our partners and allies.
Yeah, so it's a shared problem, and I think we did well. Now, out of government, so, you know, I get this by trying to intelligently read press accounts. I think we did share a lot of lessons from 2016 with our European allies for their elections in 2017, and I think it really helped. And so that kind of sharing of information, because it is a common attack against our fundamental democratic principles, absolutely. And beyond the Five Eyes, all right, with into a whole host of other, how to put it, Western liberal nations who would be vulnerable to this kind of thing. Yes, sir.
Joe Wazinski, Stelling Cybersecurity. How is the U.S. post-truth culture affecting our international relationships, our diplomacy, as well as U.S. position in the world and as world leader, in your view?
So number one, the post-truth culture swing thing is not confined to America. There are other countries in the world. I mentioned Norway, where it's kind of not happening, but there are a bunch of countries in which it does happen, and it has its own tariff to pay internally, but then it makes you more vulnerable to exploitation by folks like the Russians. With regard to America and its relationship with the rest of the world, statistically, right? When global surveys, you know, same methodology, same time of year, same scientific sampling group. So I mean, we've got some consistency here. When people around the world are asked about their confidence in America, they are dramatically lower. I mean, significant double digits lower today than they were 2-3 years ago, with the exception of Russia and Israel. And with those two exceptions, we're actually 82 points lower in Sweden than we were 3 years ago in terms of confidence in America. When late Obama administration, when I would travel and meet former colleagues in security services, if I could summarize their questions to me, it was, where are you guys? Which is kind of a reflection of President Obama's retrenchment and so on. The question I get now is, who are you guys? I was actually in Sweden for the Nobel weekend. Get weird, all right? Mike Hayden, former director of America's Central Intelligence Agency, is invited to Gothenburg, Sweden on Nobel weekend to give a speech in a day-long seminar on the meaning of truth. Now, think of that. Okay? And there was sadness and nostalgia with regard to the people I spoke to. Now keep in mind, all right, I'm talking to the elite of the elites in the Great Hall there at Gothenburg. You know, this is not a man in the street thing, but what I felt from them was the emotion, we miss America.
General, we're going to try and squeeze in two more queued up questions from the back, if you
Here we
would.
go.
My name is Mark Mack, and General Hayden, I'm a big fan of yours. I develop websites for businesses.
Nick?
And I understand that from an SEO perspective, how critical it is to create content. And you do that through social media. But it's not just the amount of content that you create that is relevant that really determines your ranking, your search. It's also the nature of the content. And what I'm learning is that it is the content that actually appeals to emotion is the one that actually gets the most clicks.
Right.
What I'm realizing right now, and I see this pattern, is that there are a lot of special interest groups. And obviously the administration that absolutely dominates the media in terms of content creation. We were talking about Russia, we were talking about China, but how concerned you are about these domestic sources essentially employing the same tactics, which they vocally actually are talking about in terms of completely overwhelming media to distract and create discourse online.
Yeah, and yes, in its more benign form, it's called advertising. Okay, and so this is going to be hard to manage. So the line I had when I saw Mark Zuckerberg testify to Congress, a couple observations. Number one, there weren't many people up on the dais who knew how to ask him good questions. All right, and that's not a hammer on them. It's just a reflection of generational differences, and we need to take another run at it. I got asked on air what I thought of Zuckerberg, and I tried not to be critical or condemnatory. I don't think there's anything malevolent here. But what I said was, here is an example of technology and ambition getting ahead of law, policy, education, and norms. And so I think the answer is kind of a recognition of that, and then to have people who are technologically smart and have our best interest, clearly defined best interest in mind, and what it is we can do to make the system itself less prone to doing what you just described. Because the way the system is designed now, you do want to read things you agree with, but the system pushes them up, pushes them to the top, rather than challenging you with alternative views.
Final question in the back, then we'll wrap up.
Good morning, sir. You've thrown a lot of things at us this morning that got us a lot thinking here, and I very much appreciate that. And I think you've answered part of my question already. And it's geared more towards, for folks at our level here in our audience, within industry, within government. And there are things, of course, that we cannot control in our environment. So things that you've mentioned already at higher levels above us. So my question becomes, what can the folks in this room, industry, government, what can we do on our level as we have made advances in this field, cyber and C4i, and we pride ourselves in trying to get the fastest, most accurate information to our senior leaders to make good decisions. Now, understanding we have things that can muddy the water for those good decisions to happen. However, given the future of disinformation, misinformation that can get mixed up in our work, that prevents us from getting the best information, most accurate, what can we do at our level to help that effort so that we can, even though we make more advances, we don't get tripped up by our own work, I should say.
Sure. So let me answer it from an Intel guy's point of view, because I think that's a subset of the broader question that you pose. You're the data carriers, you're the information providers, you're the fact bearers. So what's your responsibility? And what I say is that there are a lot of things that are legitimate influences on how a decision maker makes a decision. Let's just talk presidents, all right? There are lots of things that a president legitimately can use to make a decision, with our data being one of them, but not the universe of all legitimate inputs. And so I make the point that I rarely went into President Bush with so much tightly knit data that I was saying whereas, and then the president turns to me and says, well, hell, Mike, therefore, right? It was never quite that way. What I felt was a good day, and here's what I would share with you, and that's actually a good point on which to end. What I felt was a good day was when I could create the left and right-hand boundaries of logical, legitimate policy discussion. So it's not just, directly linear from my data point to a fixed point here in terms of the decision universe, but I could bound meaningful discussion by the reality that I could present and get the client to accept as a legitimate boundary. So that, if you're working over here, have fun, but you're dividing by 0, all right? Or if you're working over here, enjoy it, but you're presuming water is going to go uphill. In other words, neither of those are going to work. Here's the field within which you can actually have a legitimate discussion. I think that's a realistic goal for us, and more often than not, it should be an achievable goal for us. All right, you've been great. Thanks so much for the questions. Really enjoyed them.